thank you everybody for joining us this early afternoon on Monday. This is the Vermont Cannabis Equity Coalition's press conference for the release of our recommendations to the Vermont Cannabis Control Board. As we're all aware, the new state agency, the Cannabis Control Board, is tasked with defining the initial rules and recommendations for our adult use and also our medical marketplace. And so our coalition has submitted its own recommendations for the Cannabis Control Board and legislatures to consider in their process. This is a press conference for us to go through our recommendations with everybody, share why we submitted them, talk a little bit about ourselves, introduce ourselves, and to take questions from the media. Again, if you have not already done so, please take a moment to identify yourself, either in chat or through renaming yourself, so we know who is a member of the media and we can call on you at that appropriate time later in this press conference. Just to begin, we'll go through some introductions, then we will go through, we will talk about process a little bit, some process concerns that we have. Then we will go into just larger themes. We will go into racial equity and social equity, which will be handled mostly by Mark. And we will then go into agricultural access, which will be led by Graham. And then we will go into market structure and economic equity to be led by Josh, and then medical to be led by myself, Jeffrey. And we'll have a moment to introduce all of ourselves as well. Thanks again for coming. We are the Vermont Cannabis Equity Coalition, which consists of member-based nonprofits throughout the state. So really our communities are the communities, our constituencies are the communities that are most impacted by this marketplace and the rules and regulations that ultimately materialize. We are the Racial Justice Alliance, NOFA Vermont, Rural Vermont, and Vermont Growers Association. And we are growing, and we expect to have more member-based nonprofits with us as we march into the legislative session next year. And that being said, we have a little bit about sort of who we are and where we come from, and why we're doing this. And that is our vision statement. We do have a pretty clear vision for adult use and medical cannabis in the state, and we'd like to share that with you. So our vision for a cannabis economy in Vermont is one that is racially just, economically equitable, agriculturally accessible, and environmentally sound. We envision a Vermont cannabis market where Black, brown, and poor folks are assured an equitable opportunity for success within every aspect of this industry. This vision is for a racially just economy that is grounded in an understanding of our true national history and the impacts of systemic racism, the history of criminalization and disproportionate violence, enforcement and prohibition in communities of color and poor communities across this country, and the necessity for mechanisms for repair in establishing, to establish those members of those communities most impacted. In this decentralized economy, scale appropriate regulations facilitate and prioritize small businesses, outdoor cultivation, and distributed access to the wealth generated by this industry to community members throughout the state. Cannabis is grown, packaged, and distributed in ways which protect and improve soil health, water quality, and account is taken for climate change mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and human health. Cannabis really in its totality is an opportunity, and our policies and our vision really is to make sure that that opportunity is captured by those who were most impacted by prohibition and those who need it most in our communities and across Vermont. So that's a little bit about us and who we are. And I would like to go into some of our process concerns. Before I do, I just want to say that there will be a moment after all of us have a chance to give our statements to open up and receive questions from the press. So at that time, please feel free to raise your hand or use the chat, and we will bring you into the conversation and call on you. Again, please take a moment to identify yourself through renaming or using the chat with your media outlet so we can identify the members of the press here. Thank you, everybody. So I will begin with introducing myself. I am Jeffrey Piscitello, the Executive Director of the Vermont Growers Association, and I'm going to take a moment to speak to some of our process concerns. Our process concerns really began when S54 was enacted in October of last year, and it's now Act 164, 2020. Keep in mind, and this was made aware covered pretty well in the media. So thank you out there for who covered this. This enabling legislation has sort of been a slow moving train wreck from the very beginning. The nominating committee was about 30 days to 60 days behind, and this was right after the legislation was enacted. So by December of last year, we were already sort of falling behind in terms of missing our critical timelines for this legislation. Fast forward to the Cannabis Control Board, the new agency that formed earlier this year, and albeit it formed several months late, so they pretty much hit the ground running. They were forced to, and they have a lot on their plates. We feel they have too much on their plates. The lawmakers in the State House really gave too much to the CCB and too little time to figure things out. And we know that in a rushed process, it really is the voices that we should be listening to that are most impacted. So we want an inclusive process that folds in Vermonters' voices. And we feel because of the enabling legislation that as of this moment in time, the process has not been afforded that capacity. We think that the CCB has been doing an excellent job themselves in trying to build up an inclusive process, but they've been shortchanged by the enabling legislation. And it's really made their job and their due diligence difficult, if not downright impossible. So, that speaks to our process concerns. As we're aware, the CCB even had came out with a revised deadline for their initial recommendations. So our concerns have been confirmed by the CCB, by lawmakers, and others in this policymaking process. So it's important for us to call out the unrealistic timeline and identify that an inclusive process, one where all voices are heard, is really what's needed here, and that's not being afforded to the exemption of the CCB's intent. I will pause there. If any of my colleagues would like to jump in and speak about process, please do. Otherwise, I think that we should move on to racial equity and social equity with Mark.
Hey, Jeffrey, thank you for the intros, and I'm Mark Hughes with the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance. I'd like to just go back, if you don't mind, over to process and just at least flag the disruption for public comment that occurred. And I just wondered if you could just speak to that before I hop in, not to put you on the spot or anything like that.
Certainly, and thank you, Mark. So the CCB, they have a public input portal, which is a very important aspect of their website and this overall process. It allows electronically members of the public to communicate with the CCB and for the CCB to field those comments. The public portal tool on their website went down for, I believe it was 7 whole days. And if I'm not mistaken, this was October 7th to the 14th. I may be getting those specific dates wrong, but around that time period, the public portal was on the website, and it was the individuals of the public could use it, but it was not, those comments weren't being fielded, received by the website itself. And so the CCB, the agency, was not collecting those comments. We think that upwards of 30 comments were lost. And why is that important? That's important not because this process is so condensed and the time frame is so short, but our coalition publicly and formally submitted our recommendations to the CCB through their public commenting tool at that time, and they did not receive our comments because of that. They received them some 7 days later because of this website glitch. That not only impacted the general public, but also impacted our ability to communicate to the CCB. Thank you for bringing that up, Mark.
No problem, Jeffrey. Thank you for flagging that. I thought that was pretty important. Again, my name is Mark Hughes with the Vermont Racial Justice Alliance. I'm the executive director, and we are a member of the Cannabis Coalition, the Cannabis Equity Coalition, and we have continued to participate in this process since S54 and throughout this entire process across this last session with, I think it was S21. There's a lot of numbers. As far as background is concerned on racial equity and social equity in this process, I think it's important to flag at the very, very top of my discussions is, at my comments rather, is that the cannabis market is the first market to be created in Vermont since the acknowledgement of the existence and the commitment to eradicate systemic racism. Now, what does that mean? So there's a lot of activity happening across a lot of policies, ranging from Act 54 in 2017, when we first identified that there were disparities, if you will, across all systems of state government. We appointed a racial equity executive director in 2018 with a charge to eradicate systemic racism. And there's also the recent joint resolution that was released in May of this year, which quote calls on the legislature to commit to a sustained and deep work of eradicating systemic racism throughout the state and actively fighting racist practices and so forth. A lot of the work that we're doing in all of our policy work is focused on this whole idea of systemic racism, which we feel is it includes a complex array of anti-Black practices, the unjustly gained political economic power of whites, and the continued economic and other resource inequalities along racial lines, and the white racist ideologies and attitudes created to maintain and rationalize the privilege and power. So why is this important? Because this really gets to the heart of the observations that have been previously made in how the war on drugs, if you will, or policy associated with overcriminalization of Black folks, particularly as it pertains to marijuana, has been possible, has been framed in a much larger system. And this being the first time we rolled out a market while we're addressing systemic racism, we just thought it was important not to look at social equity with a status quo lens, this approach in attempting to quote unquote correct harm to those just impacted by all of the disproportionate policing. What we wanted to do is we wanted to really introduce a more substantive and an approach that accounts for the impacts of systemic racism across the entire market, from the time it's actually created through the entire process, and that means all aspects of the market, and that's what we've attempted to do. I believe that the absence of an impact, racial impact analysis by the Marijuana Commission at the beginning of this process was a spoiler, and we still have a lot of ground to recover. So what we did is we just basically introduced some very high-level principles for the CCB, some principles that this market should really take into account when rolling out this market, as reflected in the enabling statute of the Racial Equity Executive Director, as well as the panel, and that is fairness and diversity policy, systemic racism awareness training, a strategy for collecting racially disaggregated data, a mind towards hiring and promotion processes, the integration of eradication of systemic racism into organizational and individual performance reviews and processes, and finally the establishment of a program within the cannabis control folks, the board. So this is all programmatic as well as transformational. There's a long way to go, and of course all of that stuff couldn't happen at the breakneck speed that Jeffrey just described. So what we're doing is we're doing catch as catch can. What I'm about to do right now is just give you a high-level overview of some of the things that we covered in our recommendation, and if there's, I'm pretty sure everybody has had the opportunity to receive these recommendations. If there's anything in particular specific that you want to talk about, I'm happy to answer those questions. In those recommendations, we spoke of the Cannabis Development Fund. You'll see some of the language of that on our H414, which is currently on the wall in House Government Operations. There was also some recommendations around a community social equity program, and I think that this is a conversation that's really worth having, because it was originally our intent, I think, and it's kind of modeled after the Illinois policy, that we would be focusing on the damage that not just the damage that's been done to individuals in our state, but the damage that has been done to underfunded and undersupported communities across the state, the economic divestment, the violence, the historical overuse of criminal justice responses to these communities needs to be addressed. So that's one I want to flag, because I don't know that we've really gotten after that. There's also social equity programs. I'm just going to stay on the surface level of that, and I'll conclude just with the some of the area recommendations, and that's we've dived down into all of the major areas that the Cannabis Control Board and the consultants have been working on up until now. And what we've started to do is again, because we're addressing this as a whole of market approach, what we did is we just essentially went through and offered recommendations across each one of those areas, from market structure, licensing and fees, to public health, to sustainability, and even compliance and enforcement, lab safety. We've also stopped and made some specific recommendations as they pertain to Act 62. I'm going to stop there. And I think that is essentially a framework of the social equity recommendations that we make in this report. Thank you. And thanks, Jeffrey.
Thanks, Mark. Excellent. Such an important component of this marketplace. We want Vermont to be a leader in this, and the racial equity components that we have hopefully position us to be as such. Moving on from Mark, we have agricultural access with Graham of rural Vermont. Graham, if you want to take a moment to introduce yourself as well.
Hey there, folks. Thank you all for showing up today. My name is Graham Unangst-Rufenacht. I'm the policy director at Rural Vermont and a member of the Vermont Cannabis Equity Coalition. Rural Vermont is a member-based agricultural organization. We've been around for about 35 years, since the mid-1980s. We work on equity, access, food sovereignty in the agricultural realm. And I think one thing I just want to say quickly about the whole suite of these recommendations is, even though we're breaking them out into sections and we've sort of isolated them by topic, it's important that folks see these as an integrated whole. These organizations, we all came together because we have a vision for this intersectional future, within cannabis, but certainly outside of cannabis as well. And we're here talking about cannabis today. Like Mark said, this is a new marketplace. There's a lot of potential to really bring equity to this. But our goals are intersectional for this industry and beyond, and we'd like these recommendations to be seen as a whole. That said, I'm going to speak mostly to agricultural access right now. And we folded in recommendations both for the Cannabis Control Board, but which we know are within their statutory requirements to fulfill, but also recommendations for them to influence the legislature for decisions we know the legislature will have to make to affect outcomes we'd like to see. So I'm going to start I'm just going to go through, and there's going to be some of both, and I'll just point them out where that's important. And I'm going to focus on some of our sort of biggest items. And like Mark said, there's a lot of details in there. This is a big document. We encourage you to check it out. We encourage you to ask more questions in the question and answer period. There's explicit legislative intent in the legislation with respect to creating a structure which invites in the legacy growing community. I believe in legislation is called the illegal cannabis market or economy, and small farmers and cultivators. And the Cannabis Control Board is tasked, among other things, with explicitly developing tiers for cultivation, retail, and other types of licenses. So some of our primary agricultural recommendations are that the outdoor cultivation of cannabis be considered an agricultural activity, and that cannabis an agricultural product. Currently, it is not considered such. That is not in the control of the Cannabis Control Board. That is in the control of the legislature. But we would appreciate the Cannabis Control Board's support in recommending the legislature change that designation. And then primarily for the Cannabis Control Board, we focus on scale appropriate regulations, which equitably differentiate between indoor and outdoor production, which establish reasonable production caps, as well as craft tier allowances, and which facilitate direct producer to consumer market access and the ability of producers to process, manufacture, and sell their own products. So some quick details about those things. When we talk about equity between indoor and outdoor, we're talking about, for every 1,000 square feet of indoor space, we're talking about 4,000 square feet of outdoor space. That would be the beginning and what we'd expect for a craft scale, a small cultivator license tier. And then the maximum in terms of this production caps we are recommending would be 10,000 square feet indoor and 40,000 square feet outdoor. We also recommend and recognize that a lot of the legacy growers and legacy community may be growing in their homes or in places that are not large commercial structures. And we've suggested that the CCB develop a license tier to bring those folks in, to allow that type of home cultivation indoor as well. At a very small scale, micro scale, we recommended a license for about 250 square feet. That wouldn't have to meet some of the other facilities requirements as a larger commercial indoor facility. We also are asking for fees, which incentivize smaller scale craft production versus economies of scale. So again, making it more affordable per square foot at a smaller scale of production than to reward and incentivize larger scales of production. If cannabis were to be considered an agricultural product, then folks would be allowed to directly market their product themselves through on-farm sales and retail. As it's not, we are asking for a license which allows producers to directly reach consumers and vice versa, for consumers to directly reach the producers. And we think that the CCB can make that recommendation directly. They can recommend this as one of the tiers of retail, and we would recommend that they do that. Currently, they've recommended it as a potential future license, which we appreciate, but we think it really fits in at the baseline as a fundamental means of equity in this marketplace. We also address breeding, nursery sales, seed production, and more. If you want to get into more of those details in our recommendations. And I want to speak to, through, as Mark said, throughout each part of this coming industry, we sort of isolated, well, here's what we can do to really increase economic access, right? To distribute more wealth, et cetera. And whenever we strip that down, there's always those racial inequities that remain. And the way the legislature has approached this is to create means within the industry of addressing the impacts of systemic racism. But we wanted to make sure that, and we think it's very appropriate to also take money from this industry to address the impacts of systemic racism outside of this industry. And because we're talking about agricultural access, it really needs to be noted that racial inequities in access to capital, land, and housing, they will affect people's ability to participate as producers and consumers in this marketplace. We need to address those impacts with funds from this industry. We've recommended that 20% of revenue from this industry in perpetuity go towards some of the racial equity and social equity programs that Mark referred to. And lastly, I just want to say that for Vermont, rural Vermont, we are two of the three largest agricultural member organizations in the state. We have VGA, the largest, as far as we know, member-based cannabis organization in the state. We have the Racial Justice Alliance and Justice for All, two significant member-based racial justice organizations. And despite this intersection we've achieved here, we have still received remarkably little respect and invitation from particular parts of the legislature, and I would say in particular on the agricultural end. we are asking that the Senate and House Agricultural Committees invite us in to provide testimony, invite our members in, invite our community members in. And with that, I'll leave it there. I'm going to pass it on to Josh to deal with market structure and economic equity.
Thank you very much, Graham. Hello to members of the press. My name is Joshua Decatur. I have a long history in cannabis, previously as co-founder of Trace, as well as a cultivator at one point in time. And I'm very happy to be here with all the members of the Vermont Cannabis Equity Coalition, and want to underscore again, like Graham referenced, that none of these issues exist in a vacuum. They all relate to each other, and the market structure and economic equity at the heart of the emerging cannabis market, whether it's through the licenses themselves or surrounding policies, really impact everything. So let's start at the top. So currently there's limited licensing, very limited licensing, even more limited definitions around the licensing. But the result of all this is, of course, limited market access. It's difficult to have an equitable market through whatever lens, racial equity, economic equity, agricultural equity, when you have some of these limitations in place. Historically, in cannabis as an industry, and we're coming up on 10 years of having, nearly 10 years of having legal cannabis markets in the country. We've seen efforts by more moneyed, now publicly traded cannabis companies to control new and emerging markets, influence the political process and the rulemaking process happening around the industry. It's designed to give them privileged access and first mover advantage to the new money and new market that's being developed, because they have the old money, and it enables that access for them. So in that way, cannabis becomes a continuation of many of the social ills we see in every other industry around our communities and around society. Vermont has not been exempt to this. There are 3 vertically integrated businesses that are all ready to go with respect to having clarity around their permits, when they'll be able to have access to the market, and their specific allowances. Currently, local Vermonters, small businesses don't have the same privilege. They're more or less in the dark and have no legislative guarantee of being able to conduct business at any point in time. So you can see the conflict of interest that emerges there between larger companies and locally owned small businesses that would be managed and run by Vermonters. Once again, reference back to something that Graham brought up. If we're asking Vermonters to begin cultivating and to be allowed to cultivate, they must certainly also have the ability to sell directly to consumers, much like microbreweries, and how alcohol is regulated in the state. This is a process of decriminalizing cannabis. It's vital that decriminalization continues, which, with respect to that, touches on the issue of compliance and enforcement, and who's actually going to be overseeing the market and the licenses. This is something that was not addressed in our recommendations directly, as it's an emerging issue, but we strongly feel as a coalition that a law enforcement approach, so relying on the likes of the Department of Liquor Control, given the history of racial inequity, disproportionate enforcement, as well as prohibition itself, and the criminalized treatment of a plant that we're now all recognizing as a community should not have been criminalized in the first place. It's not the right direction to take. We have an existing hemp program within the Agency of Agriculture that inspects and oversees a cannabis plant supply chain. We also have the CCB itself being established, developing expertise in this market. Both of these are much more appropriate places for compliance and enforcement to come from. And again, decriminalizing cannabis means moving it away from law enforcement approaches and treating it more akin to any other agricultural product. We've seen in other states California and some of the larger West Coast markets, that market access and overproduction go hand in hand, and they've been a struggle. So keeping things scale appropriate for Vermonters is very important. And if we allow large businesses to create giant grows or giant production facilities that don't fit the size of the expected market in Vermont, we risk the market itself becoming unsustainable for anybody other than the largest participants. And once again, to reiterate, market structure and economic equity goes hand in hand with the Vermont Cannabis Equity Coalition's racial equity goals. If there's not a structure that enables small businesses to exist within Vermont, then all the social and racial equity programs in the world aren't going to make a difference to the market itself. And if we actually want to make a difference and to do something different than the status quo, if we want to live by the language that was passed in Act 54, then it's going to require that things are done differently. And that means that some of the more privileged and moneyed participants of the cannabis market are going to have to give things up. And it's not going to be the same as it has been. So we call on the legislature to live by the words they've already passed in other legislation and do something different with cannabis. And I'll pass that back to Jeffrey. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. And thanks, Graham, as well. And Mark, the last theme that we wanted to touch upon before we open up for questions is medical. And so while our coalition primarily focuses on adult use, we want to be cognizant of the medical marketplace. Since 2007, Vermont has had a medical cannabis program. The Vermont Marijuana Registry really has existed in a state of stagnation. It has not changed for over a decade. And what I mean by that is patient and caregiver access and equitability has not changed. We have the smallest and the least amount of plants allowed for medical therapeutic grows. Just to give you an example, we have 2 mature plants. New York State, which just came online last week, allows for 6 because they identify what a practical number is for a patient or a caregiver to provide medicine for themselves. That's really important. So some of the things that we're seeking, just very briefly in the medical space, is an increased plant count to make it more realistic and address things like seasonality. And if you mess up a plant, you need to make sure that you have one backed up, or else you will be without medication for a period of time. So having access and equitability in cultivation as a patient and caregiver is central to our reforms. We also are seeking an allowance for caregivers to be allowed to grow for multiple registered patients. This is commonplace in other medical programs. Because our program has not moved for over a decade, we did not integrate this this improvement to our state medical program, and other states have this. We do not have this. So we are seeking a patient allowance for caregivers. We also ask that the fingerprint step gets struck from the application process for caregivers. Act 164 actually introduces greater law enforcement into the application process. We're asking to reverse that. Some of the other things that we're seeking are eligibility. We think that it should be up to the medical professional's determination if an individual is eligible for patient and medical cannabis, and not simply they have to have a chronic or debilitating symptom. Cannabis is therapeutic and effective for more than just terminally ill individuals. So we need to broaden access. So it should be left up to the medical healthcare professional. Some other things that we're seeking are reciprocity with other states. This is, again, commonplace in other state medical programs. Vermont does not have that. And allowing greater access. So for instance, our dispensaries are allowed to deliver right now. We think that caregivers and other entities that service patients should be allowed to deliver as well. So just meeting individuals where they're at. So those are some of our gentle reforms. We invite you to check out our recommendations for the full breadth of all of those concerns and items that we're seeking. And before we open up to questions, something that we should have addressed at the top of the ticket, I just want to recognize that our group right now in this press conference is without an individual from NOFA Vermont. We've been working closely with Manny Kempner, the policy director at NOFA Vermont. We are appreciative and thankful for them being part of this organization, this coalition. They're leaders along with us. And so I just want to comment that she is missed, they are missed. And I look now to open it up to any questions for the press for any of us. All right, Bob, are you able to speak now?
Can you hear me?
Excellent. Thanks for joining us. We can hear you.
Oh, good. I had a couple of questions. One, right at the beginning, Jeffrey, you mentioned the train wreck of the whole administrative process and the board being appointed late, and you're feeling like they're moving, I guess, too fast. So would your recommendation be, let's push some of these deadlines back and maybe have to delay the retail marketplace in order for public input to have its full extent?
Thank you for asking that question. I will respond by saying this. If you look back to Senate and House committee activity, we were in the House and the Senate in January and February. We were having conversations in January and February with lawmakers publicly about the timeline for formation and implementation. And in those conversations, and you can play back this tape, there was clear frustration and just admittance that the deadlines from that point on moving forward with the CCB were not going to be met. So there was, I say that because there was recognition by policymakers that at that point in time, the deadlines for April, May, June, July, at that time were being expressed to that we were not going to meet them. So it's important for us to highlight that reality that these deadlines weren't ever going to be met. The CCB is finding itself to be 3 to 4 months behind. So that's how I would answer that. I open it up to my colleagues to jump in as well. So are we asking for more time? Yes, we're asking for a more inclusive process. Do we want to push back the formation of the market? I want to say no. I think that we can arrive at formation on time with a more inclusive process. That's what I would say.
I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that. So you're saying stick with the deadlines that we have, but make the process more inclusive. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. And if that means, moving some of the deadlines around to make it a more fair process, then by all means. Any of my colleagues want to jump in?
Sure, I can jump in there, Jeffrey. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think I differ in opinion with my colleagues, and we do frequently, just not publicly. I think that we just have to do whatever is necessary to get the market rolled out properly. Yeah, that's my opinion. I think that collectively, I want to go back just a little bit further, because Jeffrey is talking about earlier this year, and we kind of go back a little bit further than that. Okay, so we've been at this a little bit longer than that. When 160 was actually released, I think it was last year, unless my mind is not working properly. In the concerns, Bob. Oh, by the way, Bob, thanks for joining us, and I don't get a chance to say hi to you. Thanks for your work. So last year, when the governor was teetering on a veto of what became Act 160, we were asking to slow the bus a bit. Look, I understand that, you know, this is an emerging market and there is money to be made and all that other stuff, but let's look at the totality of the situation that we're in as a state right now. Currently, the speaker and the pro tem are traveling the state trying to decide what to do with excess money, trying to figure out what to do with a budget surplus unprecedented. So do we really need to be in a hurry to roll this market out, or should we roll it out properly? Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. You know, I talked to James Pepper last week about small growers, and what he said to me on the record on tape was, and I'm going to be a little bit over my head with some of this terminology, so please excuse me, but he said, in terms of determining the overall demand for the Vermont market, if I remember correctly, he was talking about 450,000 square feet of canopy, however big that is. And he wanted to first see if the demand could be filled by small growers, those being growers of 1,000 square feet or less. And that he hoped to bring the legacy growers into the legal market and do whatever he could to encourage them, entice them, because they are, what he expressed, he said, these are fabulous growers. They know what they're doing. Let's get them in the legal market. So I'm just wondering, if they start off trying to fill the overall demand with only small growers, does that take care of your concerns?
Thank you,
Maybe
Bob. Kick it over to Graham.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Bob. We've had a lot of conversations with members of the CCB, and I want to just say what Jeffrey did in the beginning, which is that the CCB has reached out to us. They've been willing to not only bring us in for testimony, but they've also been willing to bring in growers, members of our communities, which we've been really appreciative of. But I'm looking at the CCB's recommendations that they okayed a couple of weeks ago, and they include 5 tiers of outdoor production with a maximum canopy of 20,000 square feet at the largest, and actually, I'm sorry, 6 tiers of outdoor at 37,500 at the largest, and starting with 5 tiers of indoor, with the largest tier being 15,000 square feet, which is larger than the largest tier we proposed in our recommendation. So with regard to what James said, I'm not seeing that in the CCB's recommendations. And I would also say that starting at 1,000 square feet is too small for the smallest tier of outdoor cultivation, in our opinion. Based on our research and based on our recommendations, again, the legislature unfortunately limited the maximum size of a small cultivator license to 1,000 square feet in the existing statute. However, as I said earlier, we really feel due to seasonality, et cetera, that a 1-to-4 ratio for every 1,000 square feet of indoor space, approximately 4,000 should be allotted for outdoor is the appropriate amount. So if James were to come to us and suggest, let's start with the 1,000 square feet indoor grows and the 4,000 square feet outdoor grows, it'd be an interesting conversation to have. But I guess that's my response right now, is I haven't seen that in their recommendations, and that 1,000 square feet for outdoor production is not an equitable amount compared to the 1,000 square feet for indoor production. And I'll hand it over to any other colleagues who might want to respond further.
And I should clarify too, I think the 1,000 square feet he was talking about indoor, not outdoor. And while he acknowledged, as you did, the different tiers and licenses, it was his opinion that they would not issue a license to a larger indoor facility unless it was clear that the overall demand could not be met. So I'm just trying to get a handle on this myself of what he's saying and how much authority he has to fulfill his commitment.
Sure. Well, I appreciate that, Bob, and that clarification. But again, the recommendations that the CCB has released, it does the largest scale of indoor. They do have a little asterisk next to it, and it says that it wouldn't be available initially, that if additional supply is needed, they could allow the expansion into a tier 6, but that's for 25,000 square feet of indoor production. So they, even based on what they've recommended currently, it goes up to 15,000 square feet of indoor production canopy. So I don't see anything, I have not heard that from the CCB or from James, and what we see in their recommendations they recently released certainly suggests otherwise.
Bob,
So
can I
you
just
saw
ask for some clarification on your question as well too? Because at the end of your question, I think you said, would that satisfy your requirements? Or I'm just trying to make sure I understand what you're getting at, because it sounds like we're talking about one of a slew of recommendations that we have on the table.
Right. I was just listening to your recommendations and your hope that big growers don't come in and overrun the system, and that small growers be given some sort of priority affiliation. And when he told me that he would like to fill the entire state demand with indoor growers, I mean, indoor and outdoor, but indoor growers being no larger than 1,000 square feet. I thought that sort of philosophically or conceptually that you were on the same page with him, but I want to make sure that I understand that.
I think my initial response to that, Bob, is that, we haven't discussed starting at that limited scale as a coalition, and we haven't discussed starting at that small of a scale with James or with the other members of the CCB. We've seen their recommendations here, and we've offered our tiers, which we believe are small and scale appropriate, and they're less than what I see recommended. The outdoor isn't less, but the indoor is certainly less than what I see here recommended by the CCB. Other folks in the coalition, do you have a response?
Yeah, just one quick thing, and then Jeffrey, I saw you go off mute as well. I think it's important to call out that right now, the only license types that have access to the market from a retail perspective are vertically integrated permit holders, which as of now, with no caps or limits on production, could be of any size and have no incentive to sell any product grown by a small cultivator. And we've seen this play out in many states already. And it's created issues in every single emerging cannabis market. Vermont's going to not be any different. So while we are hearing some language, and some perspective from the CCB that is promising in terms of, a philosophical approach to regulating the market that prioritizes Vermonters and small businesses when it comes to these issues of, what's the scale of the grows we're going to see, et cetera, et cetera. That's great. But the reality is that it's not where we're at right now. The language on paper doesn't reflect that. So something needs to be done.
That very issue came up when we did a show on this about 10 days ago. Someone from California called up and said California made the same commitment to small growers, but it didn't take long for things to get quickly out of control. Maybe that's what you were referring to. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You bring up a great point, Bob, and thanks for bringing up that point. And that is, there's a retailer deficit out in California. They did not match their cultivation licensing with their retail licensing, and that is through a myriad of licensing issues. For instance, not enough empowering producers directly to sell to consumers, and then also not giving out enough retailer licenses, period, to brick and mortar shops. And we think that's one thing that we've learned from. We are friends with some of the advocacy groups out in California. We've connected with them. We're trying to learn from their mistakes and mistakes in other states, and we account for that actually in our recommendations. And that's why you heard Graham and Josh and Mark and others speak to emboldening Vermonters by allowing them to reach market themselves, by allowing them to reach consumers themselves. We know as small businesses, that's how they form relationships and arrive at viability is by establishing relationships directly with consumers, something California failed to do.
And that's something that came up at the board's recent hearing. They, for some reason, maybe one of you can explain it to me, they refer to this as farm gate. I don't know if, and so they were saying, yeah, just like a small farmer might be selling corn or tomatoes, that small growers should be able to sell their product directly to members of the public. That's what you would like to see. It seems like maybe they haven't put that in writing, but it seems like they're talking that that's what they want to have happen as well.
Yeah, we've had some specific conversations with the board about this, and I think you're right. There is the board is favorable to this concept. They it's hard to speak. I don't want to speak for them, but what they've told us is that they're still trying to figure out, you know, what that would look like from a security perspective, et cetera. But I think, yeah, the concept here is important. And if we were going to start with all the small scale licenses, those folks would need to have the ability to market their own product, to be able to make a price point that makes sense for them and their business. But you know, from our perspective, the reason we need a retail license for this as well is because we're talking about equity of retail. And if we're going to scale other licenses, there's no reason we can't scale retail. And they call it farm gate because there's a precedent set in agriculture where an agricultural product, a farmer can sell any product, quote unquote, principally produced on the farm, directly from the farm, without a separate retail license, without the same types of inspections as a retail outlet would receive in the Department of Health, et cetera. So that's one of the issues with this not being considered agricultural, is that type of, it sort of relegates folks to being price takers as opposed to price makers. It's basically telling someone that despite the fact that you've grown this, you're going to have to give this to someone else to sell it, unless you want to buy a retail license and set up your own retail store. And the point here is that we just want equitable requirements for different types of retail. If you're only going to set up and sell your own product, the level of risk, the amount of financial, the amount of money you're given any given time, et cetera, it's far lower. You don't need the same retail license with the same retail requirements for just selling your own product as someone does for selling other folks' products, for bringing in wholesale products, et cetera. So that's really what we're trying to establish. And the CCB did include a farm gate or producer to consumer recommendation in their potential future licenses. And I think our main point, and we'd like to make with them, is that you can include this in your retail tier recommendation. This is something you are asked to do by the legislature. This doesn't have to be tertiary or perceived as tertiary by the legislature. This can be a direct recommendation, and you're hearing this from two of the largest agricultural organizations in the state, that this is really critical to small farmers coming in, which is a part of the direct intention of the legislation. You're also hearing this from Vermont growers, which represents this legacy community. And that's also part of the intent of the legislation, to bring those folks in. And if we want to talk about racial equity as well, if you want to be able to make it possible to receive more and have an easier access point, this hits at that as well. So I think that's sort of all I have to say on that right now. If anyone else from our coalition has anything to say, I'd also be happy to talk follow up on that.
One thing, could you just remind me of, you talked about 4-to-1 ratio outdoor to indoor. What is there a minimum number that you're looking at for both of those?
Yes, based on some surveying that the Vermont Growers Association has done, and also based on existing statute in terms of establishing the small cultivator tier for indoor. We started at 1,000 square feet for indoor and 4,000 square feet for outdoor production. And again, for us, that was mostly informed by hearing from people in Vermont who are growing about what would work for them in their businesses. And Jeffrey, you could speak a little bit more to that, because you did some of that surveying that established that craft tier for us.
So Bob, the Vermont Growers Association has an annual survey. We're going into our 3rd year now. We are the new kids on the block still. You know, we formed in March of 2019, so we're learning a lot from these excellent organizations that we're working with. But our policy survey asks Vermonters, notably those in the industry, but also consumers, questions about cannabis, and we're arriving at data sets on an annual basis that are pretty unique. We shared them with the Cannabis Control Board, in addition to informing some of our decision making as a group. It's also available on our website. what we learned was the average indoor canopy size of Vermonters is 1,250 square feet. That's important because if we're trying to, as listed in the enabling statute, to bring the illicit market or the traditional market on board, we need to meet them where they're at. We can't expect businesses to, chop their store in half basically just to, join this marketplace. We need to meet them. We need to be as accessible as possible. So that's why we run those numbers, and that's why they inform some of our decision-making process. Thanks for your questions so far. Anything else as we come up on 1 o'clock?
Yeah, just one last thing. If I had to summarize what you all were saying, I want to see if I've got this correct. One, you're really calling on the board to develop more inclusive policies and take more time to hear from members of the public about a lot of the issues that you've been discussing today. You also feel it's inappropriate to have the Liquor Control Board as the sort of law enforcement agency here, that hemp probably serves as a better example through cannabis being identified as an agricultural product. And you want to make sure that there are things in place that they keep their commitment to small growers, and the experience of other states doesn't replicate itself here in Vermont.
I'll take that.
Is that close?
It is pretty close. I think that, like when you started with the equitable part of the market, I think to frame that properly, so what we're trying to do is we are trying to create and sustain a market that accounts for systemic racism. In other words, we want to. Let me just back away from that just for a second, just to properly frame a conversation about small growers and how this market works in like a vast portion of the aforementioned discussion, without framing it in systemic racism. What you create is you create a market that starts at a point where 0.2% of the land, the farmland in the state, is owned by white people. So we've got to be very careful, Bob, as we're framing this thing, as we lay it out. And I don't think to just say we want an equitable market, or to provide more access to the market, and also the discussion about the concerns that we have collectively in market structure, it really serves the discussion well. And that's one of the things we want to be really, really careful about, and the group has been very intentional about, in that we all need to be mindful of, is the way in which we talk about this cast of unlikely characters being together, and this work that we're doing is that it seems at most turns we find ourselves being pulled apart because it's easier for those in the Cannabis Control Board, those in the legislature, and sometimes even those in the press to deal with us separately, but they're going to have to deal with us collectively, because this is very intentional what we're trying to do. It's really novel. It really hasn't been done anywhere else at this level across the United States. I would just add, for example, when we talk about the work that we're doing collectively, and I think Josh talked about compliance and enforcement. I didn't get into detail on compliance and enforcement, but we got to figure out, as we roll this market out, how do we protect Black-owned businesses in a market where you're dealing with a product that's a Schedule I drug, when we know the history of enforcement? How do we create exemptions for home growers who are renters with landlord approval? How do we enforce, and how do we create a new model that emphasizes equity and accounts for systemic racism, that avoids the use of law enforcement? Yes, that's in the language in this policy, in these recommendations. How do we rezone in terms of, how do we conduct rezoning to account for the current inequities that exist? So there's all of this stuff kind of flows together. Bob, to your credit, I think you were spot on point, but I would just start by saying creating a by creating a market that accounts for the existing systems of oppression or systemic racism, because I think that without that at the front end of the discussion, not only does it not properly characterize our collective message, but it actually causes further harm to communities of color as this market rolls out.
Thank you. This has been very educational and informative for me. So I'll be following this issue for VPR as we move ahead. So I encourage any or all of you to be in touch with me especially when issues come up that you think need to be addressed. I hope that you'll be in touch.
Definitely, Bob. Definitely. I think one takeaway too is just at the end, as I just thought about it, Jeffrey, is I think philosophically we're the CCB, we're largely on the same page as the CCB as a group, and nobody has to agree with me. Just go like this if you disagree with me. But I think largely philosophically, I'm just talking to the group of folks. I think largely that's the case. I really believe that, and I think they're working their butts off over there. I think so. I think they're challenged with the timelines that they have, and due to no fault of their own. I think all of them are working. Nobody's paying me to say this, but I think all of them are working and they're doing the best they can under the circumstances. I think primarily what we're really focused on, what we're really experiencing, I think is I don't think they have the time to process this. I don't think they have the ability right now with everything else that they have coming from the recommendations. The very, very fast moving. Can you imagine, like, every single week there's, meetings every single day and from all like 5 or 6 committees, and then they aggregate all of that and they put in the public comments. Oh, the portal goes down. And that's just going on and it's churning. Our report didn't even get in the portal when we submitted it. Neither did our constituents for a week. Then we finally get it to them. And, even when we did speak to him, and we've spoken to him as well as all of the other board members multiple times, but when we spoke to him, he hadn't even been through this. He had been about halfway through it. So philosophically, I think we're on the same page. From legislatively, there are some things that are just outside of their reach because they haven't been given the authority to do so. I think there is some daylight between them and the legislature, but I just don't think they've had the time actually to really process and synthesize and formulate some really solid recommendations based upon what they're hearing, not just from us, but from everyone else. So I'll leave it there. And I should at least bounce that off of these folks so I don't get accused of just cutting them out of there.
Bob, for my own sake, I appreciate your time in joining us. And I would just add, I was not able to make the cannabis question event the other week, but if VPR or you yourself decide to hold future panel discussions in Vermont about cannabis, I'm sure one of my colleagues around this virtual table would be more than willing to participate. We are the policy leaders, I want to say, in the state for cannabis. Mark, Graham, Josh, Maddie, who's not here. And I think that having that perspective on, not speaking for my colleagues here, but on that panel in the future would only enrich the conversation for Vermonters. And I'm sorry I missed your event the other day.
You can, if you're interested in seeing it, you can go to the PBS YouTube site just to hear what James and Dr. Levine was there, and also Maxine Grad. But I thought James was pretty forthright. I don't know James probably as well as a lot of you do, but here he was on the record saying these things. So I encourage you, if you want to hear him make a commitment to small growers, and we're going to fill this thing. I'm not issuing a license above 1,000 square feet indoors until I'm convinced we can't fill demand. I thought he was pretty strong, or he made a pretty big commitment there. Now, whether or not he's able to keep that, or what needs to be put into place for him to be able to keep that. And he also talked about what's going to happen when this goes to the legislature, which all of you are much more familiar in terms of this issue in the legislature. If they start to mess around with it, who knows how it's going to end up.
Yeah,
I think your point is well taken. That cannabis thing was in response to a Nova documentary on cannabis. And I think this is an issue that VPR is going to want to keep looking at in the future. And I don't know if we'll end up doing another virtual broadcast, but I can definitely see Vermont Edition, maybe a couple of weeks or a month from now saying, all right, time out. Let's see what's happening. Let's do an update of where we are, and having your perspective for that would be very important.
Thank you, Bob. And I'll ask my colleagues to have any, maybe final statements as well.
I'm going to have to find that video of that event. Yeah, thanks for bringing some of those words here. And if all that, like Mark said, I think one of our messages for the CCB then is be bold. We understand what's coming in legislature. Legislators told us as an organization that before they acted on any of our requests, they wanted to see the recommendations from the CCB. They directed us to go there. So CCB, be bold, offer what you think is right and equitable, regardless of how you think the legislature may respond. We're here with you, and we think our community members are here with you if you're really following through on equitable recommendations, and we'll be there to fight that fight in the legislature.
Yeah, and just to reiterate again, it's great to hear James talking like that. We definitely, as we've said, don't think the CCB and us are that far apart on anything, and we appreciate the work being done there. But that's 10 to 15% of what's contained in our total recommendations, I'd say.
Right.
Even being generous, and questions like, well, how many of those 1,000 square foot growers are going to be Black? The questions like that need to be answered if we're really having a socially equitable market that's emerging. The statistics in cannabis are lower than other industries when it comes to equity, diversity, and representation right now across the country. So it's a great starting point for the CCB to be at, but there is a lot more work, a lot more conversation to be had. And they, like we're saying, they really haven't even had the proper time to address some of those issues. And that's why the legislature also needs to step up to the plate. So I hope that's heard in what we've said today as well.
Got it.
I'm pretty much fully expecting the legislature to come off in a foot race. Just off the record, I would just say that if we were just having a conversation, we've seen 2 consecutive years where we went into those sessions with expectations and hope, and even sometimes with the governor's support. And there's been nothing we could possibly do to slow the legislature down at its pace, nor have we been able to really speak into the legislature in a way in which it has felt effective. And it just seems that at each turn, just like many of the issues that we work on, there's always a reason to rush. There's always a reason to slow down. There's always a reason to do something different that doesn't necessarily reflect a true commitment to this work. We know that reapportionment, we know they'll probably return to insurance. We've got a number of things happening in the legislature, and this is what I call the second half of the game too. So we're going to be very fortunate to see much of anything happen in this session. I think we need to set our expectations there. The hope is that since this is an emerging market, there should be some level of priority set to it. And since it's the first time they've rolled one out with this mindset around systemic racism, there should be some commitment made there. H414 is on the wall in House Government Operations. I spoke to Sarah Copeland on it yesterday. I've asked her to relieve it from her committee. I hope she does, because I think they're going to be far too busy to take it up. I think somebody needs to really take the time and take a close look at this policy and synthesize the recommendations of the Cannabis Control Board, and take the time for public hearings and at least, you know, testimony in these committees so we can get some real work done on this. And it's going to take a good amount of time. So hopefully, cross your fingers, it works. But, you know, we got a lot of work to do.
Mm-hmm.
All righty. All right,
Thank you.
Bob.
Thank you for your
All right,
time.
thank you.
Take care, everyone.